from Bakü. Bakü'den selamlar. It's a pleasure to share with you the presentation on mitigation of climate change in the critical decade of action for a sustainable future. And I will underline this, that it's a critical decade of action that we're in. So let me start by sharing my presentation. I'm Şiir Kılkış from IPCC, Vice Chair of Working Group 3. And yes, so once again, welcome, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some realities about our climate future. So the point that we have reached right now is that total net anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions has reached 57.1 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2023. And you can see the contributions of these emissions and where they are coming from. And a majority of this is fossil CO2 emissions contributing to global warming. And this table is also providing where the different global greenhouse gases are coming, and also their sectoral distribution. So 26% is the responsibility of the power sector, then 11% industry, and this is based on the UNEP emissions gap report that was released just prior to COP29, and all the delegations has been informed also of these outcomes. So the IPCC Working Group 3 in the 6th assessment cycle, our most recent scientific findings, has underlined the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the full energy system and how this is requiring major transitions, including a substantial reduction in overall fossil use, the deployment of low-emission energy sources, switching to alternative energy carriers, and energy efficiency and conservation. So this is the need for an energy transition. On the sides of progress, at least 18 countries have sustained production-based greenhouse gas and consumption-based CO2 emission reductions for longer than 10 years. And when we look at the evidence of how this was achieved, this is mainly based on energy supply decarbonization, energy efficiency gains, and energy demand reductions. This has been a valuable entry point for sustaining these emission reductions. When we look, all of these strategies do come together in urban systems and has the potential to be upscaled in the years ahead. Currently, the global share of emissions that can be attributed to urban areas has been increasing. In 2015, it was estimated to be about 25 gigatons CO2 equivalent, and by 2020, this reached 29 gigatons CO2 equivalent, which corresponds. This amount corresponds to about 67 to 72% of the global share, excluding aviation, shipping, and biogenic source of emissions. When we look to the future, global consumption-based CO2 and methane emissions are projected to rise from 29 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2020 to about 34 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2050 with moderate mitigation efforts, and up to 40 gigatons CO2 equivalent with low mitigation efforts. It is only with ambitious and immediate mitigation efforts, including high levels of electrification and improved energy and material efficiency, that urban emissions can be limited to less than 3 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2050. For this reason, urban areas can create opportunities to increase resource efficiency and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the systemic transition of infrastructure in urban form through low-emission development pathways towards net zero emissions. And there are three broad strategy areas for established, rapidly growing, and emerging cities. These three strategy areas includes reducing or changing urban energy and material use, electrification in combination with switching to low-carbon energy sources, and enhancing carbon uptake and storage in the urban natural environment. When we look at urban form, this can be compact and walkable, which is also important for reducing energy and materials, or it can be dispersed and autocentric. When urban form is compact and more walkable, it has many co-benefits, including co-located jobs in housing, health, lower resource demand, and saving land for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Urban areas are also systems bringing together land use, transport, buildings, and energy. What is done in one layer impacts the other. For example, when we improve land use, it improves accessibility to public transportation, provides options for co-location, and also choices for active mobility. And urban areas are systems where multiple mitigation options, especially when integrated, have cascading effects across transport, energy, buildings, land use, and behavior. And these findings has also been taken into account in the urbanization theme here at COP29, looking into the multi-sectoral aspects in urban systems. Let me provide an example. So better urban planning has the potential to reduce energy demand by 20-25% by 2050 alone, while increasing service provisioning, those access to transport options, for example. Electrification of energy end uses in cities and efficient demand also has an important mitigation potential. And when combined with electrifying electricity supply, this raises to about 75% of the total. Urban areas are also connected to other urban areas in the region, the world, as well as agricultural forests and other land use. And for this reason, the full potential for reducing consumption-based urban emissions for net zero greenhouse gas emissions can also be met when emissions outside the city's administrative boundaries through consumption-based accounting is also addressed. Looking into electrification, this supports integrating net zero energy sources and urban infrastructure across sectors, especially when there is more flexible energy demand in mobility, heating, and cooling to absorb greater shares of variable renewable energy. And when we look at the progress made from 2010 to 2019, there have been sustained decreases in the unit cost of solar energy by 85%, wind energy by 55%, and lithium-ion batteries by 85%, and large increases in their deployment. This is an adoption of about 10 times increase for solar and over 100 times increase for electric vehicles. So technology progress innovation is at speed. And this is showing the unit cost reductions in key technologies, notably wind power, solar power, and storage, have increased the economic attractiveness of low-emission energy sector transitions through 2030. When we look across the world, electricity systems are becoming powered predominantly by renewables, and this is becoming increasingly viable. Electricity systems in some countries and regions are already predominantly powered by renewables, and at the same time, a variety of systemic solutions to accommodate large shares of renewables in the energy system have also emerged. So greater integration is essential. Integrating systems, coupling sectors, energy storage, smart grids, demand-side management, sustainable biofuels, as well as electrolytic hydrogen or green hydrogen and derivatives. This is also showing the costs and potentials. Here you will see shaded colors. The blues are where the technology, the cost mitigation potential is below the reference value. So this is replacing the fossil fuels in the energy system. And the other colors are where the costs is 0 to 20 ton USD per ton CO2 mitigated, and etc. When we look at the mitigation options costing 100 USD per ton CO2 equivalent mitigated or less, this is producing about half of the reductions that would be required between 2019 and 2030. So a large contribution is coming from solar and wind energy, energy efficiency improvements, reduced conversion of natural ecosystems, and methane emissions reductions. When we look at the typologies of urban growth and urban mitigation strategies, it is also important to look at it considering both urban growth typologies, emerging, rapidly growing, and established. And we can distinguish this coming from remote sense data for urban areas based on a study covering about more than thousands of cities across the world. So this is based on using remote sense data to classify and determine the typologies of urban areas, as well as urban form. So as I shared before, urban form can either be compact and walkable or dispersed and autocentric. When we cross-compare these two dimensions of urban growth typologies and urban form, we can have some mitigation potential. So we wanted to show this as low potential, medium potential, high potential. So it's an integrated strategy. Wherever you see the blue, it is representing spatial planning and urban form and infrastructure, and there are strategies underneath that. Whenever you see the yellow, it is electrification and net zero emission resources. The green is for urban green and blue infrastructure, and the purple pink is the socio-behavioral aspects. So all of these cities can take an integrated approach across all of these broad areas. But the entry point changes. So whenever you see the bold, it is the entry point for that type of city. So for emerging cities that have still a lot of infrastructure to build, the entry point, whether still compact and walkable or remaining as dispersed and autocentric, is the spatial planning urban form and infrastructure, co-located and mixed land use, transit-oriented development, urban infill and densification, targeted densification. For rapidly growing, the entry point is still the spatial planning urban form and infrastructure across these different types of cities. But look what happens for the established urban areas. So the entry point becomes electrification of net zero and access to net zero emission resources. And this is because most of their infrastructure has already been built. It is the question of how to decarbonize the existing infrastructure. And their entry point for this reason with the highest potential is related to the electrification and switching to net zero emission resources. So the strategies or the entry points are differing across the urban typologies. And for example, for the established urban areas, the essential role of electrification does show in these results. And this does include electric public transport, not only the private, but also taking into the traffic issues, public transport, as well as large-scale heat pumps that could be utilized in district heating and cooling networks, for example. Urban green and blue infrastructure also very important, not only from mitigation point of view, it can reduce energy use in buildings, but also from an adaptation point of view, because local urban heat island effect adds on to global warming. This type of forests, greenways, green roofs, street trees, they can make a local, with the microclimate, local cooling effect. So whenever these are placed next to buildings, for example, it's also providing shade for pedestrians. So there can be some both mitigation and adaptation benefits in settlements, ranging across networks of parks and open spaces, urban forests and wetlands, urban agriculture if there is any, water sensitive design, and this does also include sponge cities to absorb the water as much as possible and reduce to a certain extent the flood risks. The materials that are being used in urban areas is also important, whether we choose concrete, steel, or reinforced timber. This does make a difference on what the carbon footprint will be for the building materials. Reinforced timber, so strength-wise, it is still a building material. It has a lower carbon footprint than steel, and it can absorb also carbon from the atmosphere to a certain extent. So the relatively small ratio of carbon emissions to material volume is one of the comparisons for these type of building materials. Now let's come to demand-side measures. These are what citizens, society can look forward in being a more conscious citizens of the future for also addressing climate change and citizens of today. So demand-side measures and new ways of end-use service provision can reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in end-use sectors by 40 to 70% by 2050 compared to baseline scenarios. And we do recognize also that some regions and socioeconomic groups do require additional energy and resources. When we look at demand side, what does this include? It includes the emission reductions that can come from sociocultural factors, those that can come from infrastructure design and use. It can also come from end-use technology adoption. And whether this is food, whether it's for industry, whether it's transport, buildings, this will have different potentials according to the strategies. Let's look at food. If there were no demand-side measures, food emissions could increase to about 18 gigatons CO2 equivalent in 2050. But when there are different demand-side measures, so for example, sociocultural factors, dietary shifts, about 44.2% of this can be reduced. So the major strategy for demand-side measures related to nutrition, providing services for well-being of nutrition, is the sociocultural factors related to the dietary shift. Now let's come to the industry. Industry emissions without demand-side measures could be 15.4 gigatons CO2 in 2050. And there's about a 29% mitigation potential due to demand-side measures. Most of this is the end-use technology adoption, green procurement to access material-efficient products and services, access to energy-efficient and CO2 neutral materials. So this is the entry point for industry from demand-side point of view. Now let's look at land transport. You have all been using the buses to come to COP29. If there were no demand-side measures in this land transport emissions, it could increase to about 6.9 gigatons CO2 in 2050, but the mitigation potential is about 66.7% coming from demand-side measures, and 4.6 gigatons CO2 equivalent could be avoided due to demand-side measures in the land transport area. Most of this is coming from the infrastructure use, so are we using public transport, shared mobility, are there compact cities designed for urban areas, spatial planning, and the other is coming from switching to electric vehicles, electric buses, shift to more efficient vehicles. So this is the demand-side picture of the land transport. Let's come to buildings. Without demand-side measures, building emissions could be 10.3 gigatons CO2 equivalent, but about 66% of this could be avoided from demand-side measures, avoided, shift, or improved. And let's look at the socio-cultural factors. This could be energy saving, lifestyle and behavioral changes. Then for infrastructure use, it could be compact cities, architectural design, urban planning, and for technological adoption, the energy efficient building envelopes and appliances, as well as shift to renewables. We say electrification. Electrification can also have an increase in emissions if it's not associated with switching to low carbon energy sources. So without any additional measures, the baseline emissions could indicate about 6.3 gigatons CO2 equivalent CO2 of emissions in 2050. Also, through demand-side measures, it is possible to reduce this amount through, for example, load management, additional demand-side measures in industry, transport, buildings. So this can be counteracted to avoid this increase of emissions from baseline electrification practices. Choice architecture, another important aspect. It is indicating how users adopt as relevant to consumers, culture, and country context low greenhouse gas intensive options. This can include adaptive cooling and heating and cooling choices, building integrated renewable energy, electric light-duty vehicles, shifts to walking, cycling, shared pooled and public transit, sustainable consumption, and longer-lived repairable products, especially electronic products, as well as balanced, sustainable, healthy diet. So this was another finding of the IPCC from 6th assessment cycle. Transport. This can be classified into different innovation landscapes, regimes, and niches. What can be upscaled in the next 5 years, what can be upscaled in the next 10 years, and next 15 years. So integrated strategies for net zero transport, land use, and energy is very vital for transforming also transport sector in a people-centric, efficient way. Innovation. We're all curious about technologies, but also technologies have their feedback loops, enablers, barriers to change, but the stages are, first a technology emerges, then there's early adoption, there's diffusion, and then there's stabilization. If there are no barriers, this process can be very smooth. What are these? It could be market incentives, government procurement, fast diffusion rates, infrastructure development, and then coming into the mainstream. But there can also be barriers to change. So low emission innovation along with strengthened enabling conditions can reinforce development benefits, which can in turn create feedbacks towards greater public support for policy. So looking into how positive feedback mechanisms resulting in accelerated mitigation could be upscaled is also very important. Digitalization, also very important, but it depends where it is used. So if it's used in those targeted areas, for example, smart mobility, smart cities, agriculture, load management, then it can really make a difference in reducing emissions. But another finding was that digital technology supports decarbonization if it's also appropriately governed. So where we are using and for what purpose we're using digitalization can make a difference in terms of the emissions profile. Decent living standards. This was also analyzed during the 6th assessment report. So a substantial share of the population in low-emitting countries lack access to modern energy services. Eradicating extreme poverty, energy poverty, and providing decent living standards to all in these regions in the context of achieving sustainable development objectives in the near term can be achieved without significant global emissions growth. So this is also very important for sustainable development. Overall, looking into all of these findings, Cities that are planned and built much differently today, so reimagining how a change could be done there, has the potential to support more sustainable urbanization, provide co-benefits for inhabitants, and address leapfrogging opportunities. So raw material demands can be reduced, committed emissions can be reduced, and increasing the urban mitigation with the co-benefits. And in terms of synergies with Sustainable Development Goals, which is something we value very much, it's very dear to us, there are potential synergies between sustainable development and energy efficiency, renewable energy, urban planning with more green spaces, reduced air pollution, and demand-side mitigation. Let's look at some of these linkages. More details are provided in the report, but there are many multiple synergy opportunities, synergy potentials with the Sustainable Development Goals across all of these different options. Trade-offs, when they are there, can be managed, and it's good to also see some of those possibilities to make sure that it is planned and addressed beforehand, but much more synergy potential with the Sustainable Development Goals, providing food security, access to clean water, access to clean energy. This is also very important. So let's look at the urban mitigation options. The main mitigation options, from urban land use and spatial planning to electrification of the urban energy system, district heating and cooling networks, urban green and blue infrastructure, waste prevention, minimization and management, these has been assessed according to hundreds of case studies in the scientific literature to determine their synergy potentials or possible trade-offs with Sustainable Development Goals. Most of the synergies come from when urban areas integrate sectors, strategies, and innovations. For example, measures promoting walkable urban areas combined with electrification and renewable energy can create health co-benefits from cleaner air and benefits from enhanced mobility. So it is possible to have our urban areas green while providing and reducing inequalities and sustaining a livable future for all. Case studies has also proven effective for showing what can be done in particular contexts for sector transitions. For example, coordinated mechanism, electromobility, shift in mobility for service provisioning. These have been evaluated based on their enablers and their barriers. And this has also stimulated the process of learning between cities and seeing what can be done and how to accelerate transformative change for a sustainable climate future. This is what has been achieved in terms of feasibility. So this might be a keyword that we have been hearing, but it's also multidimensional. So feasibility concerns dimensions of geophysical, environmental, ecological, technological, is technology there, economic, sociocultural, as well as institutional. Is there institutional capacity, governance, and cross-sectoral coordination? So the theme for today, for example, multi-sectoral, multi-level partnerships for cities. This is very relevant also to our findings. Here, the shades is related to blue for the enablers and barriers in shades of orange. And we see that institutional capacity governance and cross-sectoral coordination has many barriers in certain contexts, but they're also enablers. So there's mixed evidence, especially for that dimension. And where institutional capacity governance and cross-sectoral coordination works is, for example, new governance mechanisms, bring departments to work together, new coordinating mechanisms, and this can be an enabler in that context. In all countries, mitigation efforts embedded within the wider development context can increase the pace, depth, and breadth of emission reductions. Policies that shift development pathways towards sustainability can broaden the portfolio of available mitigation responses and enable the pursuit of synergies with development objectives. So how can climate change be mainstreamed into development policies? Because we need climate action in order to also guarantee our food security. So this is very much interrelated. What we do in climate impacts our sustainable future. Different pathways were analyzed. Those in the C1 category, which corresponds to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot, and limited overshoot is no more than 0.1 degrees Celsius above the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So this is C1, no or limited overshoot. They were illustrative mitigation pathways for low demand, renewable energy, and shifting pathways to development. So bringing all of those strategies together. And schematically, it is also important to recognize that there are multiple tools that we can put into place if we put lower amount of tools and policies, we can lead to a future with worse climate impact outcomes, less achievement or none of sustainable development goals. But the more tools we use, policies, regulations, instruments, it is possible to also increase our achievement of that pathway and lead to a future where most of the SDGs can be improved and achieved. And one of these tools, not the only one, but one of the tools is finance. By sector, by type of economy, by region, IPCC did look into the finance flows, both the existing ones and the multiple times increases that would be necessary, for example, in energy efficiency, transport, electricity, agriculture, forest, and other land use. So as one of the tools, climate finance is very important. How it is used, where it is used, and the coordination mechanisms to make it effective is also among that toolbox that policymakers will need to consider in designing the path forward. All in all, the role of people, demand-side action, and consumption in reversing a planetary trajectory to a warming Earth towards effective climate change mitigation and dignified living standards for all has been underlined, and the possibilities of doing so has been shown in the IPCC report. For example, actions that steer energy and land system transitions, economy-wide structural change, and behavioral change can shift development pathways towards sustainability. So collective action, including avoid shift and improved strategies, are essential for our future. This shows illustratively where our future may lead to. One that you see is where ecosystems are degraded, climate change is not addressed, and is negatively impacting nature and people. The other one is where human activities do contribute to protect, conserve, and restore ecosystems and provide a decarbonized, climate resilient future. And what you see here is low emission energy production, sustainable mobility, green cities and settlements, human well-being, water security, and much more with high biodiversity. So it's integrated multi-sectoral solutions that can address social inequities, differentiate responses based on climate risk, and cut across systems that have proven to be effective and increasing the effectiveness of these options implemented by different actors. In an outlook for the future, the diversity of cities' experiences of climate mitigation adaptation strategies also brings an advantage for those city governments and other actors willing to learn together. And this was based on a cross-working group collaboration that we did in AR6 on cities and climate change. AR7, the 7th assessment cycle, is special in the sense that it will have an IPCC special report on climate change and cities. First, a scoping meeting was held in Riga, Latvia. Then the outline coming out of the scoping meeting was agreed in Sofia, Bulgaria. And the agreed outline contains many bullets, but the chapters will navigate across cities in a changing climate, actions and solutions to reduce urban risks and emissions, how to facilitate and accelerate change, showing this, and also leading to solutions by city types and regions. Let me guide you through some of the bullet points related to urban areas and the mitigation of climate change. This includes, for example, urban emission trends, including consumption-based emissions, the role of cities in emissions and mitigation, future global and city-level scenarios, considering local options, equity, sustainable development, infrastructure, and informal settlements. This will be assessed in the chapter of cities in the context of a changing climate. Trends, challenges, and opportunities. Now let's look also to the one relating to the common and context-specific urban mitigation options for spatial planning, energy covering heating, cooling, and electricity, existing in new buildings and infrastructure, mobility and transport, water, land, food, demand-side measures, and behavioral change, as well as cross-sectoral integrated approaches in urban systems, such as circularity. This is also an important point relating to the actions that can be taken in urban areas to reduce risks and emissions. Metrics for assessing mitigation adaptation options in the context of sustainable development, and the characteristics of and within cities, including service provisioning that delivers health and well-being for all, will be assessed based on the most recent scientific findings and the experiences of cities. Holistic planning and system thinking approach towards decarbonized and climate resilient cities will also be assessed, and all of this will lead to a synthesis of solution-relevant information and a collection of case studies by city types in the context of urban sustainable development. So this is something that can be looked forward for the special report in the 7th assessment cycle. Now let me return to the 6th assessment cycle. Right after that launch, And a summary for urban policymakers was co-designed together with city-level policymakers and authorities. And this process did emphasize, according to our findings, the urban and infrastructure systems transition that brings together energy, buildings, transport, and land use options within cities and urban areas, as well as the other mitigation options. Yes, so urban areas have a key role in the energy system's transition on both demand side as well as the supply side. And here again you can see typologies. A promising example coming from the COP process is this CHAMP. It's Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships for Climate Action that is seeking to support cities. A report from the UN Habitat also looked into the urban content and nationally determined contributions and identified those nationally determined contributions that have high urban content, and Turkey is part of this category, moderate urban content, low and no urban content. Currently, 39% of nationally determined contributions have moderate urban content, 34 low or no urban content, and only 27 include strong urban elements. And whether these urban elements are bringing the cities to support net zero targets, this can still be strengthened. The Montreal Call to Action on Cities, Climate Research and Governance can also change this landscape. This is calling for more support for cities and the collaboration of national governments with cities, towns, states and regions, and all over the world. This is a call to action coming from the Innovate for Cities. So more recent examples, here we see the about 20% of cities have proposed or pledged net zero targets, with those more than 500,000 inhabitants, and 13 has already had cities put these into law. For mission cities, this can be analyzed more into what is their ambition, what is their level of collaboration. So those two axes in the quadrant is for the ambition and the collaboration of these mission cities in Europe. So this is a Europe context-specific example. And the first batch and second batches, they have led to multiple climate city contracts, and the newly adopted ones has also been added to this. But let me give you one example, and I hope more universities and all the stakeholders will support our first mission city from Turkey and more in this aspect. But among all the mission cities, it is the first one to receive a mission label in associated countries. And what this is trying to achieve, and this is where more support is necessary, is increasing the renewable energy share, energy efficiency measures, behavioral change, and creation of new jobs. So this is a promising example and has more potential to do more. And I hope there's more university, municipality, and even private sector support to have this into much greater points in the future. But addressing air quality, again, very important for cities. This is a map coming from the World Health Organization, and those that are exceeding, for example, the particulate matter 2.5 micrograms per meter cubed. Urban mitigation finance, so not only at the national level but also at the local level, very important, and we can see at least a 5 times need to upscale urban climate finance in this context. So addressing climate change is more urgent than ever. So in this presentation I have showed findings from the IPCC as well as recent findings from relevant reports. And here you can see a real-time, almost real-time tracking of the state of our climate. And you can see where we are, so 1.19 in terms of the average for the last decade, degrees Celsius. So this is above previous industrial levels. We have already exceeded 1.19 degrees Celsius. So this is not an annual value, it's a 10-year average value. And much more can be seen also in this portal. And where we are in terms of the carbon budget, for example. So the urgency of shifting unsustainable energy use, and land use change, lifestyle and patterns of consumption and production, and have a chance of addressing climate change effectively continues and requires all of the stakeholders' support. The UN emissions gap report. Let me also return to this one. So it is showing the implementation gap and the emissions gap between the existing trend, current policies, and the 2 degrees Celsius range and the 1.5 degrees Celsius range, and comparing this to conditional and unconditional nationally determined contributions. It shows that the emissions gap in 2030 and 2035 remains large compared both with pathways limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to 2 degrees Celsius. And with current policies continuing, the UN emissions gap report estimates a 3.1 degrees Celsius exceedance of global warming with 66% change, and all the larger sizes of the circles you can see the outcomes of where we're headed, and it's only with conditional nation-determined contributions plus all the net zero pledges that this can be brought down to 1.9 degrees Celsius, but I underline this is still above the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold for the climate. The UN emissions gap report is also comparing the global efforts that was coming as the outcome of the first global stocktake in the Paris Agreement and the number of nationally determined contributions that do include relevant measures. So what was this? If we look at the first global stocktake outcome, we see tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030, doubling global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements, accelerated efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power, accelerated efforts globally towards net zero emissions energy systems, and transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy system, and many others. So you can also see the number of nationally determined contributions that are including these global efforts coming from the global stocktake outcome. When we look at 2035, the mitigation potentials across energy, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, industry, transport, buildings, the total of all of this, including other, is 41 gigatons CO2 equivalent. So there's much more potential, and all of this is costing the amount that you see there per ton CO2 equivalent mitigated up to USD 200. So this is in that range. What can be done across all of these sectors, and what is the total? So total is 41 gigatons CO2 equivalent according to the UNEP emissions gap report. The investment needs, so let me just quickly touch upon that, is between 6 to 10 times more than the annual finance flows in the 2021-2022 type of comparison. So another finding coming from the UNEP emissions gap report. So we saw the opening of the high-level segment of this COP29, putting the ambition of determining a new collective quantified goal on climate finance to enable the upscaled climate action in this critical decade. We also saw the need to review the Warsaw International Mechanism and provide guidance on operationalization of the new loss and damage fund. But more we wait, the more consequences there will be. And we also saw the expectation of modalities for implementing the global stocktake outcomes and carrying forward the decision to transition away from fossil fuels as some of the expectations. And I would also like to underline that in the opening high-level segment remarks, coming from the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, we are seeing the outcomes and the results of the UNEP gap report that global emissions would need to fall by 7.5% per year through to 2035 to return to us to a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And we have the know-how, tools, and financial resources to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. It's about coordination, it's about teamwork, it's bringing all the partnerships together. But we would also like to imagine a world where transport is no longer polluting, our cities are green, and we have transitioned away from fossil fuels. And there are many more actions that can be done in this critical decade of action. So I call upon all those listening to the presentation to focus on the possibilities and remain committed into the climate action in this critical decade. Thank you very much for listening and this call to action as well. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Just a simple one. When is the city's report due?
Thank you very much. So the city's report in the 7th assessment cycle, it was decided during a panel meeting held in Istanbul, Turkey, the schedule. It will be released in early 2027. So the process is the outline has been agreed in Sofia, Bulgaria in August of this year. The authors are in the process of being selected after being nominated, and after that they will have the opportunity to collect the most recent scientific findings, write the chapters, and have the review process, and have it completed and approved and considered in 2027. But it will be the first report of the 7 assessment cycle. Maybe I would like to ask one question to all of you. What are some promising developments that you observe for upscaling climate mitigation action in this critical decade? And you can either think about this right here in the Sustainable Future Platform room, or you can also think about this afterwards. But I would also like to maybe ask you, it can be a city level, it can be even university level, it can be municipality level, agriculture level, farmer level, national level, any level, but maybe some promising developments that could be an example to the world. If you would like to share with me or to others, I would like to also discuss and with you during this process. So it is said in Azerbaycan, then let me say thank you, teşekkürler, öz teşekkürler, and I will speak and discuss with you maybe afterwards.